How gonzo were things at the peak of Canada's cannabis craze? Let's just say the folks running billion-dollar companies weren't exactly your button-down Bay Street types.
So Terry gobbles one of these things down, and then he realizes a little too late that I'm in trouble. He's walking around, and he's got his Aurora hat on and his Aurora shirt, and he's the man. You know, his company is worth $15 billion, and he's out of his mind on cannabis.
Now that's how you do an industry conference. Hi, I'm Paul Haberstrood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. The highs were high, the lows were low. 6 years after legalization, we check in on the wild ride for Canada's weed industry. Also today, free real estate in this country may seem like a pipe dream, but you really can get a couple acres in the woods for free, with one or two catches. Up first, Canada's talked about diversifying trade for the last 160 years. Now feels like a good time to get on it, but it won't be easy. Did you have a best friend growing up? Like, you did everything together? Then one day they turned on you, said they weren't your friend anymore?
We don't need them to build our cars. I'd rather see Detroit or South Carolina or any one of our Tennessee, any one of our states build the cars. They could do it very easily. We don't need them for the cars. We don't need them for lumber. We don't need them for anything. We don't need them for energy. We have more energy than...
We thought we were buddies. Now Trump wants us to sit by ourselves in the lunchroom. We've known for a long time that being too dependent on the US makes us vulnerable. And 3/4 of our trade does go there. We sell them everything from pianos to potash. So if they don't want that stuff anymore, can we just trade with other countries? Well,
our economy is about 7,000 kilometers long and a few hundred kilometers deep. Normal trade in North America flows primarily north-south, not east-west.
Dan Churiak is a former deputy chief economist with Canada's Foreign Affairs Department. He's now the head of Churiak Consulting. Dan says we've been talking about diversifying trade since before we were even a country. We just haven't been that motivated to do it. As for why not, well, look at our big cities. Vancouver is 5,000 kilometers from St. John's, but a truck can carry a load to Seattle in 2 hours. The US has 340 million customers. It's the richest country in the world. Of course we're going to sell there. Geography has made the choice for us. If you look at any country's exports,
they flow to the largest and closest countries first, and then smaller and smaller and smaller to the smaller and more distant countries, okay? So the pattern of geography is baked into the actual pattern of Canadian exports.
This is something known as the gravity model of trade. The US has a lot of pull. China is our second largest trading partner. The value of what we sell to the US is 20 times more than what we export to China. We could try to sell more there, but moving stuff across the Pacific is expensive. It's not like we're shipping microchips. The bulk of our exports are, bulky.
We sell a lot of softwood lumber. Almost all of it goes into the U.S. We sell a lot of iron ore. Most of our oil and gas goes into the United States. Why? Because it's heavy stuff. It's got a high weight to value ratio. It doesn't travel very far. So the distance difference from Australia to China and from Canada to China is only a few thousand kilometers. That difference is sufficient to drive all of Australia's resources to China and all of ours into the United States.
Our 3 biggest exports, oil, autos, metals, and minerals, all fall into that category of heavy stuff. Those 3 alone make up 40% of our exports. We can try to sell more of that stuff abroad, but the farther we go, the more expensive our stuff becomes. But right now, Canadian businesses are motivated to find new customers. And regardless of what happens next, Danielle Goldfarb thinks Trump's tariff threat has crossed a line, and she doesn't think we'll go back to business as usual. She's a trade expert at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy.
Every household and every business over the last week, people have been panicked and angry and upset and really thinking like, my goodness, our assumptions that we made about this market and about the stability and security of it and about our kind of longstanding, yes, we have these little tiffs at the margin, but like, this is not a tiff, this is an attack. It seems unlikely that we would decouple from the Americans, but we have to somehow figure out how to reduce the risk and vulnerability that this attack on Canada has presented. And is this the moment that we start to say, okay, like what are our alternatives?
Hey, it's a big wide world out there. Just because it's easier to head south doesn't mean we can't go east and west.
We do have now trade agreements with many other parts of the world, with partners who are interested in kind of having, secure, free trade, many fast growth economies. And many of these agreements are underutilized by Canadian companies.
For a lot of companies, developing new markets hasn't been worth it. Maybe now that changes, and our free trade agreements with Europe and Asia start looking better. Canada can't replace U.S. trade, but Dan Churiak says we can make moves to drum up trade abroad as well as here at home. And if tariffs do come,
let's not be too disheartened then, okay? So let's just kind of say, what happens the day after? Supposing that the tariffs did actually go up. Well, first of all, because people don't have immediate options, they still buy the stuff, they pay the 25% tariff. Second thing that happens is producers on both sides of the border run to Washington or to Ottawa and ask for exemptions.
We've watched this happen before with Trump's steel tariffs the first time he was in office.
So I'll give you a stat, 207,000. That is the number of exemptions that the U.S. Department of Commerce gave to American producers to be able to import steel and aluminum without paying the tariff. Basically, the tariff wall becomes a wall of Swiss cheese. Trade flows through it, it flows over it, and then stuff flows around it.
Trump can bluster about not needing Canada, but after the dust settles from the press conference, U.S. businesses will still want our stuff, and they'll go to bat for it.
They need to trade with us just as much as we need to trade with them. So regardless of what happens in Washington, we have a lot of boots on the ground in the United States of America who are looking to make sure that North-South trade continues.
If Trump follows through on his isolationist vision for the U.S., it will be a body blow for Canada's economy. A core part of his economic thinking is bringing back factory jobs. Autos, manufacturing, this is where Canada is most vulnerable. Dan says there are no easy answers for how we'll protect those jobs or those workers, but he does see opportunities. To go it alone, the U.S. will need to keep a lot of its current exports at home. Instead of selling, for example, steel to Mexico, that steel will have to stay in the U.S. to feed the domestic economy. That will leave holes in all kinds of markets around the world. Dan says every one of those holes is an opening for Canada.
So when a change happens in one of those markets that causes everything else to rearrange, the models tell us that we will capture our fair share of the rest. It's a small share for us, but we will capture some of that. So we will capture some of the action. And of course, if we're out there hustling and working the market with our trade commissioner service and whatnot, then we will actually make up some of the losses in the U.S. market. It'll be hard to do that, but we will in markets that we can't even anticipate.
Dan says Canada will figure things out. It won't be easy. Finding new trade partners will take work. But whatever comes our way, we won't just roll over.
Can we build infrastructure in Canada? Absolutely. So we can afford it. Can we develop companies in Canada that scale up companies based on the talent that we've got? Absolutely. So we can afford that. So let's not kind of flip out and panic. Food will be on the table. There will be jobs. One of the things that is most heartening to me is just how there's been a mobilization en masse of Canadians writing and thinking, and without any coordination from Ottawa on responding to this new threat. And if we do that and hang as a nation, there's nothing that we can't do.
If Trump decides to take his ball and go home, well, you can't make someone be friends with you. But if the US changes its mind someday, Canada and the rest of the world, we may be playing a different game. On your Radio and by podcast, this is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. You may have heard the saying, drive until you can afford it. It's the reality of house prices around Canada's biggest cities. But some people are going even further afield, to places where seldom is heard a discouraging word, the skies are not cloudy all day, and the land is sometimes free.
The Walkins live in an old farmhouse at the end of a long driveway, 1.5 kilometers long to be exact, and they get a lot of snow.
That was one of the first things my husband bought was a tractor. So he's got a tractor with a plow and a snowblower on it, yeah.
So how did Carrie Walkins and her family end up here? Well, a few years ago, their family of 4 was about to become a family of 5. They were living in BC's Lower Mainland.
And just seeing how the cost of living was changing and growing, I mean, we wouldn't have been able to get a house.
They knew they had to move, but they weren't sure where.
And then we heard a free land offer.
That enticed the Walkins to move from the city to the country, Cape Breton Island, and they haven't looked back. From Reston, Manitoba to Mundare, Alberta, home of the world's biggest sausage, there's still free land to be had. It's one way rural places attract city folk. McAdam, New Brunswick did this. A few years ago, the village put 16 residential lots up for sale for $1 each.
So we had to bring in about 5 people to answer the phones.
Ken Stanix is the mayor of McAdam.
I can remember my chief clerk looked at me and she said, "My gosh, what have you done?"
He says it only took a few weeks for all those $1 lots to be snapped up.
When you're a small community, you have to think outside the box as to how you're going to attract businesses, how you're going to attract people to live here.
McAdam is just an hour drive from the city of Fredericton, and even the properties that aren't free are still cheap. You can get a 3-bedroom house with a covered deck and a big yard for under $200,000. That could be the difference between owning and not owning. Even in Canada's most affordable cities, like Halifax, the average price of a detached home is still more than $600,000.
I think there is a sense for many people, younger people in particular, that the largest cities have become very, very difficult in terms of affordability.
Kevin McQuillan is a research fellow at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. He says for the longest time, if you lived in a small town, you left for the bright lights of the big city. But over the last 5 years, that's changed.
Well, I think the thing most striking to me has been the movement of people out of Canada's largest cities and going to a whole variety of places, sometimes medium-sized cities, but sometimes smaller communities as well.
Now, Canada's largest cities are still growing, largely because of new immigrants, but many longtime residents are leaving. In the last 5 years, roughly twice as many people left Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal than in the previous 5 years. Whereas towns like Squamish, BC, and Sylvan Lake, Alberta, have seen their populations jump. Kevin says remote work has made it easier for Canadians to make the move to smaller communities. Over the last few years, McAdam has grown by 130 residents. The offer of free land helped, but so did the publicity. It brought in a bunch of curious homebuyers who ended up staying.
A lot of people now, when they talk to me, they say, "I don't know half the people in McAdam anymore."
But it hasn't changed McAdam that much. Ken Stanek says the commute is still a breeze.
If you have 3 cars meet at the intersection and they're all waving you through, no, you go first. No, you go first. That's rush hour traffic in McAdam. Yeah.
For The Cost of Living, I'm Danielle Nerman.
It was billed as the next big thing for Canada's economy. We'd be a world leader, exporting our innovations. It would bring tourists. And the glory days for cannabis were glorious. But, like a puff from a one-hitter, it was more of a quick high. Ben Kaplan is the author of a new book, Catch a Fire, The Blaze and Bust of the Canadian Cannabis Industry. It tracks the industry's biggest players through their gummy-fueled ride on the way up to where things are now. Hi there.
Good afternoon. Hello.
So, Ben, you described the cannabis industry's wild rise when billions of dollars were pouring into it. What's the best story you heard about that time when things were really rolling?
My favorite story from my favorite character, just in terms of pure kaleidoscope color, is when Terry Booth was the CEO of Aurora, and let's say Aurora was valued at $15 billion. And Terry is at a cannabis convention in Vancouver, and while he's the CEO and the founder, he's also a man of the people, and he is a cannabis user. So Terry takes a bite of a edible cookie, and this was a non-licensed edible cookie, which nowadays, if you take an edible cookie, it's going to have a cap at 10 milligrams, which will still get you spun around. But if you take an edible cookie and it's, say, 1,000 milligrams or 5,000 milligrams, because you're dealing with the cannabis underground, it's going to be a little less like a cannabis edible and a little more like acid or hallucinogenic mushrooms. So Terry gobbles one of these things down, and then he realizes a little too late that I'm in trouble. And he's walking around, and he's got his Aurora hat on and his Aurora shirt, and he is tripping, running through this crowd and just trying to get away from the people. And he's a heat score because he's got his hat on, and he's the man. His company is worth $15 billion, and he's out of his mind on cannabis.
Well, this isn't exactly like the button-down Canadian banking industry. What kind of people at that time, like on the way up prior to legalization, what kind of people were attracted to the industry?
I love that question. The best way I could summarize it is a guy who started a company called Lyft, and they used to put on big conventions and hold sort of like the cannabis Oscars. And he's this young James Franco-looking kid, and he told me, we're risk takers having the time of our lives. That's who they were, and that's what they were doing.
Well, a couple of those risk takers you follow in the book pretty closely. You mentioned Terry Booth. The other person was Bruce Linton. Who were Terry and Bruce?
Well, these were the two biggest guys that really realized early on that scale was everything. When the cannabis stocks were so popular and they really couldn't miss, the deal was that investment bankers wanted to give you money, and then you spent that money, and when you did, you increased your growth capacity. What that was how much weed hypothetically you could grow by how big you could build out your greenhouse. So people would give them $100 million, $250 million, and then they would deploy that, and in Terry's case, build a 1 million square foot greenhouse in Edmonton, and that would see his stock rise because he had hypothetically this growth capacity. So these guys were they weren't tested in the market with companies of this scale. They were really Wild West founders who hit on something at the right time and then realized that fast growth would big up their stock price.
But do you get the sense that were they smart business people? Were they savvy promoters, or were they just kind of lucky?
I mean, I think any sort of success story is going to be a combination of all of those things. For sure, like when you take Bruce Linton's case, there was no particular reason why Bruce should have done with Canopy what he did. Why did Canopy become the biggest one? Why was Canopy at one point worth $22 billion? It wasn't because he grew the best weed. That was never part of the equation. He built the biggest brand fastest, and he knew how to sort of frame it in a way that would resonate with the market. So for sure that took skill, for sure that was promotion, for sure that was seeing the trend before anyone else. He wasn't a cannabis consumer. He just saw something, an article in the paper that said that this was going to be legal. We're talking about 2013, well before Justin Trudeau proposed recreational marijuana being legal, back when it was only a medical product. But there is that fortuitous luck factor, because imagine having a marijuana company when you had 250,000 medical patients who could buy your product. Then Trudeau comes along and he says, listen, we're going to make everybody over 19 able to use your product. And now all of a sudden you went from 250,000 customers to 27 million.
What was the peak? Like, what was the moment when things were just rolling, the money was pouring in, and things couldn't have got better, but now in retrospect, you realize, oh, you know what? That was as good as things got.
When the Roadrunner was running off the cliff and you could tell that there was no ground beneath him, we legalized October 17, 2018. In January 2019, these companies had their peaks. And then very soon thereafter, once legalization happened and it was no longer hypothetical, like Deloitte was saying how big the market was going to be. At one point, Deloitte had forecasted that the market for cannabis was going to be bigger than wine and beer and spirits combined. You could sort of say anything because they hadn't been done. And since Canada was the first G8 country to legalize marijuana, there was nothing to compare it to, right? So we didn't know what the ceiling was because you could kind of say whatever. I mean, would pot replace cigarettes? Would it replace Coronas? Would it replace, any one of these things? At one point we said, yeah, it's gonna. But then after legalization, it was like, whoops, no, it's not.
All right, so the bubble bursts, right? They start closing these projects down. We're kind of in a bust time for the industry, but obviously it still exists. Like, what's happened to the industry through the bust and into now?
First of all, out of all those big companies, the Canadian founders, we had $16 billion cannabis companies. All of the original Canadian founders are gone, and none of them are worth $1 billion except one, which is Afria. So that's the first thing. But the mid-tier companies, there's plenty of publicly traded cannabis companies like Organigram or Canara. Their expenditures aren't massive. They're profitable. I think Canara had 14 straight quarters of positive EBITDA. So, they have seen, they've seen what happened to Bruce and Terry, and their companies, they spend a lot less, and the bottom line is much more important.
What about on the retail side? I mean, people used to see weed stores popping up on every corner. Now, not so much. I mean, it feels like there's a rationalization happening there as well.
It's the same sort of thing. I mean, at one point, these stores were printing money when there wasn't that many of them. So what happens? Everybody gets into the business. There's too many of them. So then what happens? Okay, most of these places are going to close. And then what's going to happen, just like with the thing with the cannabis companies, the ones that left with the big pockets are going to survive. And when there's not as many competition, they're going to do very well again. I mean, right now, the biggest retail chain is called High Tide. He's got 191 stores. And, he sees his business as being $850 million domestically from cannabis sales in these 191 stores eventually. So, there's still big money in weed. It's just, it was so big and then everything fell. And now it's like, what is happening? And it's kind of, Canada is the world's #1 exporter of pot. That is what we do better than anyone else. The one closest to us in terms of distributing pot is Portugal, and we're like 3 times as large. So we have a glut of weed in this country, so much so that we send it to Israel and Australia, Portugal, Germany. Germany's a huge customer of Canadian pot. Here, what costs $1.50, we can sell the same exact thing over there and get $4 a gram.
What about the people who were there during the first inning and even before that in the pregame, the Bruce Lintons, the Terry Booths? Did those early players who got rich, did they stay rich? Did they get their money out?
I think those original founders that got into weed with money also left with money. It's Joe Schmo at the barbershop who put in $500. And those people, investors lost something like $131 billion gambling on Bruce and Terry.
after chronicling this whole ride, the billions that were made and then the billions that evaporated, and thinking about it for so many years as you have, I mean, what do you take away from this? Any lessons?
I mean, one gigantic lesson is like, look, Canada was so pioneering with this. Bruce had Martha Stewart, Drake, and Snoop all coming to Toronto, not even coming to Toronto, going to Smith Falls to meet with him. He was running the show. We had Silicon Valley was coming here. MedMen had Spike Jones make their commercial, but when they wanted to list publicly, they had to come here. I mean, we became ground zero, this bright shining star of this nucleus of a brand new industry that started overnight and that we did without following, by we, Canada, did without following anybody's lead, without asking permission, totally on our own, and we created this enormous industry. So look, you're thinking about Trump's tariffs and everything that's going on in the world. We created, and we can create, homespun industry, $16 billion companies, overnight startups with a new wave of dyed-in-the-wool entrepreneurs that came out of nowhere, and they kind of rose to the top with this. So if we did it with weed, we can do it with anything.
All right, we might have to. Ben, thanks so much for all that.
Appreciate it.
Ben Kaplan is the author of Catch a Fire, The Blaze and Bust of the Canadian Cannabis Industry. Before we go, we want to know if Trump's tariff threats have changed anything for you. Give us a call and tell us how you're feeling. Our number is 1-866-550-COST. That's 1-866-550-2678. Or email costofliving@cbc.ca. The show is based in Calgary. The Cost of Living is produced by Danielle Nerman and Jennifer Keane, with help from Jeff Kynog. I'm Paul Haversrud. Thanks for listening.